the three of us, and Warren introducing and Muhammad looming over, looking at it, crazy for me. I mean, you're not expecting someone to say something like that to you, because his eyes were lit up, and I don't know what he expected me to do.
What if everything you thought about the future was only scratching the surface? From emerging tech to hidden power structures, the world is shifting faster than most of us realize. But behind the headlines and hype lies a deeper, more complex story. One that challenges our assumptions and forces us to ask, where are we really headed?
He's perfectionist, as almost everyone we've discussed would fall into that personality characteristic. They're a perfectionist.
There's a certain mystery that surrounds Jack Nicholson. For decades, the actor has stood as one of Hollywood's most iconic and unpredictable figures. From his unforgettable roles in the Shining and Chinatown to his off-screen persona filled with contradictions, he's been both celebrated and criticized. Known for his charisma and confidence, Nicholson also developed a reputation over the years for being difficult behind the scenes. And while most actors kept their experiences quiet out of respect for his legacy, not everyone was willing to stay silent. British actor Ray Winstone, known for his no-nonsense attitude and gritty roles, shared his story about working with Nicholson during the production of The Departed. The film, released in 2006, was a major success. Directed by Martin Scorsese and featuring a star-studded cast that included Leonardo DiCaprio, Matt Damon, and Mark Wahlberg, it was a gritty crime thriller that swept both box office numbers and awards. On screen, Nicholson played Frank Costello, a chaotic and menacing mob boss. Winstone portrayed Mr. French, Costello's loyal and cold-blooded enforcer. But while their characters shared a close and intense dynamic, the reality between the two actors was far from collaborative. In a 2014 interview, Winstone opened up about his experience. He didn't try to sugarcoat it. His exact words were, "We just didn't get on." That simple phrase carried a weight of frustration. Winstone didn't sound angry for the sake of drama. Rather, he sounded tired and disappointed. Winstone described Nicholson as someone whose ego had taken over. He said, "I thought he was so far up his own arse it was unbelievable." It was a sharp statement, particularly coming from someone like Winstone, who rarely engages in public feuds or gossip. He's known for being professional and focused on the work, not on the politics or games that sometimes come with the film industry. According to Winstone, Nicholson's behavior off-screen stood in stark contrast to the respect many had for his status. Winstone had grown up admiring Nicholson's performances. Films like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and The Shining had cemented Nicholson's place in cinema history. But once they were working together, the admiration quickly faded. He accused Nicholson of being not just aloof or self-important, but actively rude and dismissive. This wasn't limited to moments between scenes or closed-door exchanges. Winstone said Nicholson treated crew members, extras, and even his own family with a noticeable lack of respect. One moment in particular stayed with him. During filming, Winstone's wife came to visit the set. According to Winstone, Nicholson didn't even acknowledge her politely. "He wasn't even polite to my missus," he said. For Winstone, who came from a background where respect and decency are non-negotiable, this was more than just a personal slight. It represented everything he found wrong with how some stars behaved once they reached a certain level of fame. That one moment told him everything he needed to know. The tension between the two actors nearly turned physical. Winstone admitted, "If he had been a younger man, I'd have definitely knocked him out." He didn't say it with bravado, it came out like a man recalling a time he was pushed too far. A boundary had been crossed, and the only thing stopping it from escalating was age, not tolerance. Despite the personal tension, Winstone remained professional. He didn't walk off set or let the feud affect his performance. In fact, many believe his portrayal of Mr. French was one of the film's most quietly powerful performances. There was a coldness in his stare and a restrained intensity in his delivery that, looking back, might have been fueled by the real tension boiling beneath the surface. instantly explained that the experience left him with a lesson, not in acting, but in character. He said, "It showed me how not to treat people. I don't care how famous you are. That stuff doesn't fly where I'm from." It's a reminder that for some actors, professionalism isn't just about delivering lines or hitting marks. It's about how you carry yourself when the cameras stop rolling. For a film that became such a major success, earning multiple Oscars and critical acclaim, The Departed had its share of behind-the-scenes difficulties. Martin Scorsese managed to keep the production moving smoothly, but according to several crew members, it was clear that Winstone and Nicholson didn't get along. Some said the two avoided each other as much as possible outside of scenes. Others described moments where their disagreements created visible discomfort on set. And yet, the final product didn't suffer. That's part of the intrigue. Despite all the tension, both actors delivered performances that supported the film's overall power. But if anything, it also speaks to the reality that what happens behind the camera often doesn't match the image presented to the public. Winstone never seemed interested in capitalizing on the drama. He didn't write a tell-all book or make his story the center of headlines. His comments came up naturally in conversation, in interviews where he was asked about the project, and when he spoke, it came across as honest and matter-of-fact rather than bitter. What makes this story stand out is that Winstone wasn't attacking Nicholson's talent. He still recognized his co-star's body of work, but admiration for someone's past doesn't mean overlooking bad behavior in the present. That distinction is often blurred in Hollywood, where status can sometimes protect people from criticism. In this case, Winstone wasn't having any of it. Nicholson, for his part, never responded publicly to the remarks. Over the years, he's become increasingly reclusive, stepping back from public life and choosing to stay out of the spotlight. Whether he saw Winstone's comments or had anything to say about them is unclear, and perhaps we'll never know. But the takeaway here isn't just about a disagreement between two actors. It's about expectations, what we expect from our heroes, what we tolerate in the name of fame, and what lines shouldn't be crossed, regardless of how big someone's name is. For Winstone, the experience seems to have reinforced his belief in humility and respect. No matter how many awards someone has or how legendary their status, it doesn't excuse bad manners, especially not towards people who aren't in the spotlight, like a crew member doing their job or a wife visiting her husband on set. And in a time when more stories are being told about what really goes on in the film industry, Winstone's account feels like one more piece of a larger puzzle. Behind the cameras, beyond the red carpets, and far from the carefully curated images, the film industry is still built by people. Some are respectful, some aren't. And it's often the honest stories, like this one, that help peel back the curtain on what fame can sometimes hide. As for The Departed, it remains a standout film, but for those who look a little closer, Winstone's performance might carry just a bit more weight now. Because behind that cold stare was a man trying to stay composed while dealing with someone he found deeply disrespectful. Jack Nicholson's career has always been filled with bold choices and memorable roles, but behind the scenes, his working relationships haven't always been smooth. One of the more notable examples of this involved his time directing the 1978 Western comedy Goin' South. This film wasn't a major hit, but it's remembered not just for its cast, but also for a behind-the-scenes clash between Nicholson and comedian John Belushi. The tension between the two reflected deeper differences in personality and work style, and while their confrontation wasn't widely publicized at the time, it's since become one of the lesser-known stories from Nicholson's directing career. To understand what happened, it's worth remembering where both men were in their careers at the time. Jack Nicholson was already a major Hollywood star by the late 1970s, having starred in classics like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and Chinatown. He was respected as a serious actor with a rebellious streak. Going South was only his second time directing a feature film, and he was hoping to bring a mix of charm and edge to the project. John Belushi, on the other hand, was still riding high from his breakout success on Saturday Night Live. He was one of the biggest stars in American comedy at the time, known for his wild energy, unpredictable humor, and willingness to push boundaries. However, his off-screen behavior had started to gain attention too. His reputation for partying hard, taking drugs, and arriving late to sets was already well known by the time Going South went into production. According to reports from the set, Nicholson had cast Belushi in a small but memorable role, believing his comic timing could add something interesting to the film. But once production began, the relationship between the two quickly started to fray. Nicholson, who took his work seriously and valued professionalism, was not impressed by Belushi's erratic behavior. Belushi was reportedly unprepared, often late, and brought a chaotic energy to the set that clashed with Nicholson's approach as both an actor and a director. Some insiders later said that Nicholson initially tried to be patient. He understood that Belushi's style was different, and he may have hoped that the tension would work in the film's favor. But as the production continued, it became clear that their differences were more disruptive than productive. One source described Nicholson as growing increasingly frustrated, especially when Belushi's antics started to interfere with filming schedules and scene setups. For a director trying to balance performance with behind-the-camera responsibilities, this was more than just a personality clash. It was affecting the entire production. It didn't help that Belushi, despite his popularity, had a tendency to challenge authority. He was known to push back against directors and rewrite lines on the fly. That approach might have worked on Saturday Night Live or in improvisational comedy, but on a film set, where time and money are always tight, it became a problem. Nicholson reportedly had several conversations with Belushi about staying on track and respecting the work, but they didn't seem to have much effect. Eventually, Nicholson made a decision that surprised some people on set. He reduced Belushi's screen time significantly. Although he didn't remove him from the film entirely, Belushi's role was cut down in editing, and many of his scenes were trimmed or left on the cutting room floor. The message was clear. Nicholson had had enough, and he wasn't going to let one actor, no matter how popular, derail the project. This move didn't sit well with Belushi. Friends of his have said he was disappointed, feeling that he had been treated unfairly. From his perspective, he was just being himself, a free-spirited performer who liked to experiment and improvise. He may not have understood just how much stress his behavior was causing for others on set, especially for a first-time director like Nicholson, who was already dealing with the usual pressures of leading a film. The fallout between the two didn't result in a public feud, and neither of them spoke at length about it afterward. But those who worked on the film said it was clear there was no love lost between them. Nicholson didn't work with Belushi again, and while he never spoke openly about what happened, it's widely believed that Belushi's conduct on Going South left a lasting impression on him, and not a good one. In hindsight, the clash between Nicholson and Belushi was probably inevitable. They were two very different kinds of performers, with different views on how a film should be made. Nicholson valued discipline, preparation, and focus. Belushi thrived on spontaneity, chaos, and raw energy. While those approaches can sometimes complement each other in creative settings, in this case they created more friction than harmony. It's also important to consider the wider context. Belushi's problems with drugs and alcohol were beginning to take a toll on his life and work. Just a few years after Going South, Belushi died from a drug overdose at the age of 33. His death shocked the entertainment industry and led to a broader conversation about the toll of fame and the pressure of being constantly in the public eye. Some have speculated that his behavior on the Going South set was an early sign of how deeply he was struggling behind the scenes. Nicholson, for his part, went on to have a long and successful career. He returned to acting full-time after Going South, and continued to build his legacy with roles in films like The Shining, Batman, and A Few Good Men. While he directed again later, Going South remained one of his more unusual projects, and the issues he faced during that production may have influenced his decision to focus more on acting in the years that followed. The story of Jack Nicholson and John Belushi is not just about a difficult working relationship. It's a snapshot of two influential figures in Hollywood whose paths crossed at a complicated time. For Nicholson, it was a reminder of how hard it is to control a film when everything around you is unpredictable. For Belushi, it was another moment in a career filled with highs and lows, and perhaps one of the early signs that his personal struggles were starting to affect his professional life. There's a moment in every actor's career when they're forced to confront not just the challenges of a role, but the realities of how they're perceived in an industry that often prizes youth and appearance above everything else. For Cher, that moment came while working on the 1987 fantasy comedy The Witches of Eastwick, where she starred opposite Jack Nicholson. On paper, it was a dream project. The film had a big-name cast, including Susan Sarandon and Michelle Pfeiffer, and was based on a popular novel. But what happened behind the scenes revealed something far more complex. At the time, Cher was already a household name. She had enjoyed a successful career in music, television, and film. But even with her reputation, she found herself struggling to be taken seriously in certain Hollywood circles, particularly when it came to leading film roles. And when she was cast in The Witches of Eastwick, it wasn't exactly a straightforward process. According to interviews and industry reports, she had to fight for the role. She wasn't the first choice, and some involved in the production questioned whether she was the right fit. Cher later shared in interviews that early on, she heard about some less than kind comments made regarding her casting. The word was that Jack Nicholson himself had raised concerns about her age and looks. Whether he actually said it directly or it came through other voices on the production, the implication was clear. She didn't look like the kind of woman Jack's character would be interested in. For Cher, it was a personal blow. She had dealt with criticism throughout her career, but this felt particularly painful coming from someone as respected and iconic as Nicholson. It's worth noting that Jack Nicholson by then had solidified his place as one of Hollywood's most powerful and charismatic actors. He had a reputation for being both charming and intimidating, depending on the situation. So when Cher caught wind of the comments, it wasn't just hurtful. It made her question whether she even wanted to continue with the film. According to her own account, she came close to walking away from the project entirely. What makes this story stand out, however, isn't just the friction, it's how things shifted. Despite the rocky start, a turning point came during a lunch between Cher and Nicholson. It wasn't a production meeting or a scripted moment, it was just the two of them sitting down, talking. And that conversation, as Cher later explained, changed everything. Nicholson didn't apologize in a traditional, overly sentimental way. That wasn't really his style. But he did something arguably more powerful. He listened. He asked her why she was upset, and when she told him, he didn't get defensive. Instead, he acknowledged her feelings. It was a rare moment of vulnerability and empathy from someone not usually known for either. In Cher's words, Nicholson looked her in the eye and said, "I don't know what you're so upset about. You're a great actress, and I'm glad you're here." For her, that was enough. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was sincere. It showed that behind the public persona and the sharp edges, there was a man who could recognize the importance of validation and respect. From that point on, the working relationship between the two reportedly improved. They didn't become best friends, but there was a mutual respect that allowed them to move forward with the project in a productive way. And when The Witches of Eastwick hit theaters, Cher's performance stood out. She brought strength, wit, and complexity to the role, and many credited her with anchoring the film's emotional core. What's particularly interesting is how this story illustrates the dynamics of power, perception, and resilience in Hollywood. Cher was navigating an industry that often marginalized women over a certain age, even those with proven talent. And Nicholson, whether intentionally or not, represented that system. But rather than crumble under that pressure, Cher pushed back, not with aggression, but with honesty. And in doing so, She earned not just the role, but a level of respect that may not have come any other way. Looking at the broader context, The Witches of Eastwick itself was a film about female empowerment, even if it was wrapped in supernatural comedy. The three lead women, played by Cher, Sarandon, and Pfeiffer, gradually realize they've been manipulated by Nicholson's devilish character and ultimately take back control. In a strange, poetic way, what played out behind the scenes mirrored the narrative on screen. Cher, like her character, refused to be sidelined or underestimated. This isn't to say everything was smooth sailing after that. Hollywood remained, and still remains in many ways, a difficult place for women who age out of traditional leading lady roles. But Cher's experience on that film became a turning point, not just professionally, but personally. It reminded her, and perhaps others in the industry, that respect has to be earned, but it also has to be demanded when it's missing. Years later, when she reflected on the experience, Cher didn't hold on to bitterness. She didn't launch a public attack on Nicholson or make the incident into tabloid fodder. Instead, she told the story with a kind of even-hand clarity. She acknowledged the pain, but also the growth. She didn't shy away from naming the issue, but she also gave Nicholson credit for recognizing the situation and adjusting his behavior. That nuance is rare in Hollywood stories, where narratives are often shaped into simple heroes and villains. It's also a reminder that big personalities don't always mean big egos. Sometimes, people say things they don't fully understand the impact of. And sometimes, it takes just one honest conversation to change the course of a relationship, professional or otherwise. For Cher, the film turned out to be a success. It reinforced her credibility as a serious actress and opened more doors. For Nicholson, it was another complex, charismatic role in a long line of them. But perhaps more importantly, it became an example of how even the most seasoned and powerful actors are capable of growth. It also served as a quiet statement on the value of compassion and humility, qualities that don't always get the spotlight in Hollywood, but often make the biggest difference. Jake's Hoop Solidario. Ultimately, the story of Cher and Nicholson on The Witches of Eastwick isn't just about two stars clashing on set, it's about the challenge of confronting stereotypes, the courage to speak up when something feels wrong, and the power of listening. And in an industry driven by ego, that's no small achievement. Geena Davis is known for many things. She's an Academy Award-winning actress, a former Olympic-level archer, and one of the most prominent advocates for gender equality in media. But there's one lesser-known story from early in her career that stands out for its unexpected encounter with one of Hollywood's biggest legends, Jack Nicholson. What happened between the two of them didn't lead to any public fallout, nor did it cause any major Hollywood scandal. Still, it remains a fascinating example of how personal boundaries and industry power dynamics often intersect behind the scenes. At the time of this story, Geena Davis was still relatively new to Hollywood. She had already starred in a few major films, most notably Tootsie in 1982 and The Fly in 1986. But she hadn't yet become the full-fledged star she would later be. After roles in Thelma and Louise or A League of Their Own, like many aspiring actresses, she was navigating the pressures of fame, the expectations of appearance, and the unpredictable waters of dealing with influential men in the industry. In interviews over the years, Davis has spoken candidly about how she was initially unprepared for the kind of attention she started receiving once she entered Hollywood. Not just from audiences, but from powerful men in the business. One of the more memorable moments she recalled involved an unexpected phone call from Jack Nicholson. Yes, that Jack Nicholson, three-time Oscar winner, the face of iconic characters like Jack Torrance in The Shining and the Joker in Batman, and a man whose off-screen reputation as a ladies' man has long been part of his public image. According to Davis, the call came shortly after she'd finished working on Tootsie, a project that brought her a lot of attention. At that point, she had already experienced some of the usual challenges that young actresses face, including unwanted advances. That's when she received some helpful advice from one of her co-stars, Dustin Hoffman. Hoffman, who played the lead role in Tootsie, reportedly told her something simple but powerful. Just say, "Well, you're very attractive, I would love to, but it would ruin the sexual tension between us." It was, essentially, a polite way to deflect flirtation without offending or burning bridges. A necessary skill in a business where careers can be shaped by relationships and perceptions. Armed with this bit of wisdom, Davis soon found herself needing it. Nicholson had somehow gotten her number, something that wasn't all that surprising considering the way information moves in entertainment circles. When he called her, Davis recalled being shocked. She didn't have a professional reason to be speaking to him at the time, but there he was, introducing himself, charming as ever, and then, as she tells it, quickly shifting into flirtation. He asked if she'd like to come over to his place sometime. Now, this wasn't a casting call. There was no film project being discussed. Davis, who was still trying to navigate the industry without upsetting anyone powerful, immediately remembered Hoffman's advice. She repeated the exact line, "You're very attractive. I would love to, but it would ruin the sexual tension between us." To her surprise, Nicholson laughed. He wasn't angry. He didn't get defensive. He actually respected it. He said something like, "Oh man, where'd you get that?" It defused the situation, and from all accounts, that was the end of it. What's notable about this interaction is that it didn't turn into a feud. There was no confrontation on a set, no long-term tension, no bad blood. It was simply a moment in time, an interaction that likely wasn't uncommon in the 1980s Hollywood scene. What makes it worth talking about today is what it reveals about the environment young actresses had to work within, and how moments like these could go very differently, depending on how they were handled. Davis has reflected on this story not with bitterness or judgment, but as a learning experience. It highlighted how often women in the industry had to develop ways to protect themselves while trying not to alienate powerful men. She didn't name Nicholson as someone who harassed her. If anything, she noted that he backed off without issue. But the fact that she needed a rehearsed line in the first place says a lot about the expectations placed on women navigating early careers in Hollywood. There were no women left alone, except one wearing a silk lining, a revolver, and what also stands out is the professional etiquette Davis displayed. Instead of reacting harshly or feeding into the moment with fear or desperation, she chose humor and subtlety. It allowed her to maintain her dignity, set a boundary, and still avoid unnecessary conflict. And in return, Nicholson's response, though flirtatious to begin with, was in that moment surprisingly decent. That may not seem like much, but in an industry where so many others have faced serious misconduct, that distinction matters. In a broader sense, Davis's story is a reminder of how personal power and social influence often shape interactions behind closed doors in the entertainment business. There are countless stories of women who weren't able to deflect advances or who suffered consequences for doing so. Geena Davis, whether by luck, preparation, or a combination of both, managed to sidestep what could have been a more uncomfortable situation. What makes the story even more resonant is that it didn't stop Davis from continuing to push for changes in the industry. In fact, it might have contributed to her growing awareness of how deeply rooted gender biases were in the media. Years later, she founded the Geena Davis Institute on Gender in Media, an organization dedicated to increasing the presence and improving the representation of women in film and television. It's become one of the most respected advocacy groups in the industry. Looking back on that moment, Davis didn't frame it as a scandal or controversy, but simply as part of what it meant to be a young actress during that era. That's probably why the story gained so much attention when she shared it. It felt real, grounded, and refreshingly free from exaggeration. It was just one of those only in Hollywood stories that say a lot without having to be overly dramatic. There's also a degree of humanity in how it played out. Nicholson, for all his bravado and reputation, did lash out when Davis declined his invitation. He seemed to accept it and move on, which in itself might say something about the difference between flirtation and coercion. And for Davis, it was one more experience that helped shape how she would approach fame, power, and personal agency in a notoriously difficult industry. In the aftermath of a global crisis, rebuilding societies takes more than just repairing infrastructure or restoring economic stability. It requires trust, transparency, and accountability. As the pandemic unfolded, these qualities were tested at every level, from local communities to international institutions. The public's faith in both government bodies and private corporations experienced significant strain, and with that came calls for reform. People began questioning not only how decisions were made, but also who benefited from those decisions. Many governments struggled to respond quickly, often lagging behind in implementing effective policies. Critics pointed to a lack of preparedness despite numerous warnings and simulations conducted over the years. In some cases, budget cuts to public health systems or delays in securing protective equipment left healthcare workers exposed and systems overwhelmed. These lapses weren't merely operational failures, they were failures of governance and foresight. At the same time, transparency became a buzzword, but one that didn't always reflect reality. For instance, some officials were accused of withholding critical data or altering reporting methods to manage public perception. In several countries, the release of COVID statistics was inconsistent, making it difficult for researchers, journalists, and even local officials to make informed decisions. Public trust declined as citizens felt excluded from the truth and disempowered in the face of opaque bureaucracies. Similarly, questions were raised about accountability when it came to contracts and procurement. Emergency measures allowed for expedited deals, bypassing standard procedures and opening the door to cronyism and corruption. Reports surfaced of companies with little relevant experience being awarded multi-million-dollar contracts. In some instances, political connections seemed to be a stronger qualification than actual capability. This raised concerns not only about the misuse of public funds, but also about the broader erosion of democratic processes. In the private sector, especially among pharmaceutical companies, the issues of accountability and transparency were just as complex. The rapid development of vaccines was a scientific achievement, but it also brought attention to questions about pricing, intellectual property rights, and equitable distribution. Many companies received substantial public funding to support their research and development efforts, yet the terms of these deals were often kept secret. Critics argued that if taxpayers were footing the bill, the public had a right to know the terms and to benefit from the results. One major point of contention was vaccine equity. While wealthy nations secured millions of doses in advance, many lower-income countries were left waiting. The World Health Organization's COVAX initiative was launched to address this imbalance, aiming to provide fair access to vaccines globally. However, COVAX faced its own challenges, from funding gaps to logistical hurdles. Meanwhile, pharmaceutical companies in affluent countries engaged in what some referred to as vaccine nationalism, hoarding supplies and negotiating exclusive deals that limited access for others. This inequity wasn't just a humanitarian concern, it posed a practical risk to the global recovery effort. Public health experts repeatedly emphasized that the virus doesn't respect borders. As long as it continued to spread unchecked in parts of the world, new variants could emerge, potentially undermining vaccination efforts elsewhere. In this way, vaccine inequality wasn't just unfair, it was short-sighted. Beyond the health implications, the broader economic recovery also raised questions of fairness and accountability. While some industries thrived or bounced back quickly, others continued to struggle. Small businesses, especially in the service and hospitality sectors, were hit hard, with many closing permanently. In contrast, major tech firms and e-commerce platforms saw record profits. This stark contrast led to debates about whether recovery efforts were truly inclusive, or if they disproportionately favored large, well-connected corporations. Stimulus packages and government aid were essential for supporting economies, but the way these resources were allocated came under scrutiny. In some countries, large companies received significant bailouts, while smaller enterprises faced complex application processes or were simply overlooked. This led to calls for greater oversight, more targeted support, and systems designed to ensure that help reaches those who need it most. Citizens also began to rethink their relationships with institutions more broadly. The experience of the pandemic prompted many to ask deeper questions about the kind of society they wanted to live in. For some, the crisis exposed systemic inequalities and prompted a renewed focus on social justice. For others, it highlighted the fragility of systems previously assumed to be robust. The result was a collective moment of reflection, though not always consensus. This moment also saw a surge in civic engagement. From community-led initiatives to mutual aid networks, individuals and groups stepped in to fill the gaps left by slow or insufficient government responses. Volunteers distributed food, checked on vulnerable neighbors, and helped local businesses adapt. These grassroots efforts underscored the power of community action and demonstrated that accountability doesn't always have to come from the top down, it can also come from within. Still, for lasting change to take root, structural reforms are necessary. This includes re-evaluating emergency preparedness strategies, investing in resilient healthcare systems, and ensuring that public institutions are built on a foundation of transparency and trust. It also means holding those in power accountable for past missteps, not through scapegoating or political point scoring, but through rigorous independent review and a commitment to learning from experience. International cooperation will be key as well. The pandemic made it abundantly clear that global challenges require global solutions, whether it's sharing scientific data, coordinating logistics for future crises, or addressing the underlying drivers of inequality. No single nation can go it alone. Building stronger international partnerships will be essential for tackling not just health emergencies, but a host of interconnected issues, from climate change to migration to cybersecurity. In the corporate world, stakeholders are increasingly calling for transparency, not just as a legal requirement, but as a core ethical principle. Investors, employees, and consumers alike are pushing companies to be clearer about their practices, especially in areas like supply chains, data privacy, and sustainability. The pandemic accelerated these conversations, forcing organizations to think more critically about their social responsibilities and long-term impacts. Technology will undoubtedly play a role in shaping a more accountable future. From blockchain-invaded supply chains to AI-driven data analysis, innovations can help increase visibility and streamline oversight. However, these tools must be used wisely. Technology can just as easily be used to obscure information or centralize control. Ensuring that these systems are governed fairly, with checks and balances, will be critical. Education and media literacy are also crucial. A more informed public is better equipped to demand accountability and recognize misinformation when they see it. As the infodemic around COVID-19 demonstrated, the spread of false or misleading information can be just as dangerous as the virus itself. Strengthening institutions that promote factual reporting, critical thinking, and civic dialogue will help build a more resilient society. Looking ahead, there is a real opportunity to build back better, not just economically, but ethically and socially. This requires commitment from all sectors of society: governments, businesses, civil society, and individuals. It won't happen overnight, and it won't be easy. But if there's one lesson to take from this global crisis, it's that accountability and transparency are not luxuries, they are necessities. They are the foundation for trust, and without trust, no system can function effectively for long. By confronting the hard truths of what went wrong and being honest about the work that still needs to be done, societies can emerge stronger. The road forward is still being paved, but the direction is clear. A world where decisions are made in the open, responsibilities are taken seriously, and the voices of everyday people are not only heard but respected. That's the future many are now striving to build.